The prairie was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that carried weight, as though the land itself held its breath. The sun, low on the horizon, painted the sky in strokes of blood orange and bruised purple, throwing long shadows over the dust. She lay there, her wrists rubbed raw where the ropes had bitten deep into her skin, her lips cracked from thirst, her voice nearly gone. When she whispered, it was more breath than words, "They all watched me die." The cowboy knelt beside her. His hat was tipped low, shading his eyes, but she felt the sharpness of his gaze even without seeing it. He cut the last knot and the ropes fell slack, coiled like dead snakes against the dirt. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her arms were too heavy, her spirit too fractured. She expected him to walk away, to do as the others had done, stand back and let the life drain out of her while dust and memory swallowed the last of her name. But he didn't. He did the unthinkable. Instead of leaving her, he lifted her gently into his arms, the roughness of his calloused hands softened by something she hadn't felt in a long while, mercy. She struggled to understand it. Men had seen her broken before, and none had cared enough to stop. They had watched her fall, turn their backs when she begged for water, when she cried until her tears ran dry. They had called her finished, a lost cause. But here was this cowboy, with his weathered coat and tired boots, carrying her as though she were something precious. Her head rested against his chest. She could hear the steady thump of his heart beneath the dust and leather. It startled her, that sound. It meant she was still tethered to life. The warmth of his body seeped into her frozen will, coaxing her to believe she wasn't already buried. He didn't speak, not at first. He just carried her across the barren stretch until they reached his horse, a tall, muscled bay that shifted nervously as if it, too, sensed the weight of what was happening. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, carrying more truth than comfort. "They thought you were gone. That don't make it so." She wanted to laugh at that, but her throat was too dry. Gone, yes, she had been gone long before the ropes, long before her captors decided her life wasn't worth the effort of keeping. Yet the cowboy's words cut through the fog, planting something stubborn inside her, defiance. He lifted her onto the horse first, steadying her trembling legs as though he'd done it for a child. Then he swung up behind her, wrapping one arm firm around her waist, the other guiding the reins. They rode into the sinking sun, the wind carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and freedom. The land stretched endless before them, but for the first time, endless didn't mean hopeless. She thought about the eyes that had watched her fade. Eyes that had seen her suffering and turned hollow, satisfied to let the dirt claim her. And here was this man, this stranger, refusing to let her slip into silence. She tried to ask him why, but the words tangled in her throat. All she could manage was a rasped whisper, "Why didn't you leave me?" The cowboy's jaw tightened. He looked straight ahead, the horizon burning fire red before them. "Because I know what it feels like," he said finally. "To be left to die." She shivered, not from the cold, but from the truth in his voice. He had carried his own ghosts, his own abandoned past, and somehow, in saving her, he was saving himself. The trail beneath the horse's hooves stretched long, the world fading into night. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed she might live to see morning. The prairie wind bit against her cheeks, carrying grit and whispers of the wild, but still she leaned into the cowboy's arm. Because it was the only solid thing she had left to hold her. His horse kept a steady rhythm, its hooves striking the dry earth in a cadence that felt like a heartbeat, grounding her in a world that had nearly slipped away. Every step forward was proof she had not been left behind, proof that she still breathed. Her wrists throbbed from the burns left by the ropes, angry red marks seared into her skin, a cruel reminder of how close she had come to being erased. She looked down at her hands, trembling against her lap, wondering if she'd ever stop shaking. The cowboy noticed. He shifted the reins into one hand and gently covered hers with the other, pressing her quaking fingers down as if to anchor them. No words passed his lips, but the gesture said more than speech ever could, that he wasn't about to let her fall apart alone. They rode for hours beneath a sky that darkened from orange to violet, until the stars blinked awake one by one. The air cooled, heavy with the scent of sage and dry grass. Coyotes cried somewhere far off, lonely and hungry. She startled at the sound, and he pulled her closer against him. His chest was solid, his breath slow, as if he had no fear of the night. She drew from that steadiness, trying to borrow some of his strength. At last, they came upon a small creek bed, the water thin but enough to drink. He dismounted first, his boots crunching against the gravel, then reached up to help her down. She stumbled, her knees too weak, but he caught her before she hit the ground. He didn't let go until he was sure her legs would hold. Kneeling at the bank, he dipped his hands into the water, bringing it to her cracked lips. The cold shocked her tongue, but she drank greedily, her throat sighing at the relief. She tried to thank him, but her voice failed. He simply nodded, as though thanks were unnecessary. He filled a small tin cup from his saddlebag and pressed it into her hands, then crouched nearby as she drank again and again. He didn't rush her, didn't demand her story, didn't pry into her pain. He only waited, eyes sharp but patient, like a man who knew that silence sometimes healed more than questions. When she finished, he lit a small fire, careful and quiet. The glow touched his face, carving his features into lines of grit and weariness. His hat shadowed his eyes, but she caught the faint glint of something raw when he glanced at her, something that felt both familiar and dangerous. He had known loss. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the way he moved with care, as though carrying invisible weights. She drew her knees to her chest, staring at the flames. Words finally broke through the cage in her throat. "They all watched me die," she whispered. Her voice shook, each word clawing its way into the open. "Every one of them. They tied me up, left me there, and when I cried for help, not one hand reached out." The cowboy didn't look away. He fed a stick into the fire, sparks shooting up into the night, then said, "You're still here. That's what matters." She laughed bitterly, though it came out more like a cough. "I don't even know why. They wanted me gone. Maybe I should have been." His jaw flexed. He leaned forward, his eyes catching the firelight now, hard and unflinching. "Don't say that. They wanted you dead because you still matter. Folks don't waste their hate on nothing." The words sank into her like stones dropped into deep water. She wanted to argue, but something inside her cracked, releasing a flood of quiet tears she hadn't meant to shed. She turned her face from him, ashamed of her weakness. But he didn't move, didn't flinch from her breaking. Instead, he sat close enough for her to feel his warmth, steady and unyielding, as if saying without words that she could unravel. "Here and still be safe." The fire burned low. The night pressed close around them, but she no longer felt the cold so sharply. Her body began to relax for the first time in what felt like years. When sleep finally claimed her, it was sudden and heavy, like falling into a deep river. She woke at dawn to the smell of coffee and the crackle of the fire being stirred back to life. The cowboy handed her a tin cup, and she sipped slowly, the bitter heat filling her with strange comfort. He hadn't left. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of fierce respect that unsettled her. As the sun rose, painting the horizon in gold, he packed their gear. She watched his movements, efficient and quiet, and wondered again why he had stopped for her, why he had cut her down when everyone else had stood by. She finally asked, voice trembling, "Why did you help me?" He cinched the saddle straps tight before answering. "Because I know what it means when nobody does." His voice carried a heaviness that told her not to press further, though curiosity burned in her chest. They rode again, the land stretching wide and endless before them. The trail wound through dry gullies, across rolling plains where the grass shivered in the breeze. Hours passed in silence, but it wasn't empty anymore. The weight of his presence beside her made every step forward feel like a rebellion against the ones who had wished her gone. At midday, they stopped beneath a lone cottonwood. He shared jerky and hard bread from his saddlebag, and though the food was rough, it filled her hollow stomach. She chewed slowly, her jaw aching from disuse, but each bite made her stronger. He finally spoke as he adjusted his hat, his gaze on the horizon. "What's your name?" She hesitated. The name felt foreign, heavy with all the sorrow tied to it. But she whispered it anyway, barely audible, as though afraid the wind might steal it away. He nodded once, repeating it quietly, as if to remind her it still belonged to her. Hearing it on his tongue stirred something inside her, something she thought had died long ago. They rode on for days, the land changing slowly around them. She began to regain her strength, her body healing in small ways. The tremors in her hands grew less frequent, her steps steadier when he helped her down from the horse. But her heart still carried scars too deep for time alone to mend. She woke some nights with a strangled cry, shadows of ropes tightening in her dreams. Each time, the cowboy was there, his hand firm on her shoulder, his voice quiet, telling her it was over. That she was safe. She wanted to believe him. One evening, as the sky burned with another bloody sunset, she finally told him the truth. How she had been betrayed, how people she trusted had turned their backs, leaving her to the cruelty of men who saw her as nothing more than weight to be cast aside. She spoke until her voice broke, until the words dried up into silence. When she finished, the cowboy didn't offer hollow comfort. He didn't say she would forget, didn't tell her to move on. He only said, "They watched you die. But I didn't. That makes all the difference." And somehow, it did. The days stretched into weeks, their path winding toward a future she couldn't yet name. But with every sunrise, every mile they crossed together, the girl who had whispered she was already dead began to feel something stir inside her again. Not just survival, but the fragile beginnings of life itself. And always, the cowboy rode beside her, a silent promise in his presence. The wind carried dust across the plains, a restless whisper that filled the silence between them. Each day bled into the next, the trail long and unforgiving, but she began to measure her life in the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the steady presence of the man beside her. She had no clear sense of where they were headed, whether to a town, a ranch, or simply deeper into the wilderness, but the destination mattered less than the journey itself. What mattered was that she wasn't alone, that she wasn't still tied to a post with death circling her like vultures. Her body grew stronger. The hollow feeling in her chest eased little by little, though the memories still clung sharp as thorns. At night, when she lay rolled in a blanket beside the fire, she sometimes caught herself listening for the sound of boots approaching, for laughter in the dark, for the cruel voices of men who had watched her fall. But those sounds never came. The only noises were the crackle of firewood and the low hum of the cowboy's voice when he spoke to his horse as he checked the reins. Those moments became the balm she didn't know she needed. One afternoon, as the heat bore down and the horizon shimmered like liquid, he pointed toward a cluster of hills in the distance. "There's water there," he said. "A spring. We'll rest tonight." When they reached it, she was startled by the sight of green, the grass lush around the bubbling spring, willows leaning low, their branches trailing in the cool water. Birds darted above, their songs sharp and bright, a stark contrast to the emptiness of the desert they had crossed. She knelt at the spring and let the water run over her wrists, soothing the angry scars. For a moment, she closed her eyes and almost forgot the ropes, almost forgot the eyes that had seen her suffering and turned away. The cowboy tended the horse, his movements precise. When he returned, he set down a pouch of dried beans and coffee, beginning the simple ritual of supper. She watched him, wondering at the quiet patience with which he moved. He was not a man who rushed. Every act seemed deliberate, as though he knew haste had no place in survival. She found comfort in that, though she didn't say so. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars spun overhead, she found herself speaking before she meant to. "I thought about letting go," she admitted, her voice breaking against the stillness. "When they left me there, I thought maybe it was easier if I stopped fighting." The cowboy poked at the fire with a stick, his jaw tightening. "But you didn't." "I wanted to." "Doesn't matter," he said firmly. "Wanting and doing are two different things. You're still here. That's the part that counts." She stared at him, the firelight dancing across the rugged lines of his face. "And if you hadn't come?" He lifted his eyes then, meeting hers with a steadiness that pinned her where she sat. "Then the world would have lost something it didn't deserve to lose." The words lodged in her chest, stubborn and heavy. She wanted to reject them, to cling to the belief that she was broken beyond repair. But the way he said them, quiet, unyielding, planted a seed she couldn't ignore. The next morning, she rose before him. She gathered kindling, awkwardly at first, her hands clumsy from inexperience. When he woke, his gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he nodded, a flicker of approval crossing his face. She realized then that she wanted his approval, that it mattered to her whether he believed she was worth saving. The trail tested them in new ways. Storms rolled across the plains, sudden and merciless, forcing them to huddle beneath the scant shelter of rocks while rain lashed down in sheets. Her body shivered with cold, and the cowboy pulled her close, wrapping his coat around them both. Lightning split the sky, thunder shaking the earth, but she felt oddly safe pressed against him, his arm firm across her shoulders. When the storm passed, they emerged soaked and weary, but alive. And every hardship endured at his side stitched another thread into the fragile fabric of her will to live. Once, they came upon an abandoned homestead. The house was little more than a shell, its roof half collapsed, windows shattered, the door hanging loose on its hinges. Inside, dust lay thick, and the silence of long neglect pressed heavy. She wandered through the rooms, fingers trailing over broken furniture, imagining the family that had once lived here. Perhaps they, too, had been driven out, swallowed by the cruelty of the land or the violence of men. She paused in what must have been a child's room, the remnants of a wooden toy lying forgotten in the corner. Something inside her ached. She thought of the life stolen from her, the years she had spent only surviving, never living. The cowboy found her standing there, staring at the toy, and he didn't speak. He only placed a hand lightly on her back, a steady presence that pulled her from the fog of grief. Days stretched into weeks. Her steps grew surer, her laughter returning in small, cautious bursts, surprising her each time it escaped. The cowboy rarely smiled, but when he did, it softened the hardness of his face, and she found herself looking for those moments, craving them as proof that even the most weathered souls could still feel light. But the past was not so easily left behind. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a group of riders appeared in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat, terror flooding her veins. She recognized the stance of men who rode with purpose, who carried danger like a cloak. Her body froze, her mind screaming with memories of ropes and laughter in the dark. The cowboy noticed her fear. He pulled the horse to a stop, his hand tightening on the reins. His other hand hovered near the revolver at his hip, calm but ready. "Stay close," he murmured. The riders approached, dust rising in their wake. Their eyes scanned her, lingering too long, making her skin crawl. One of them sneered, spitting into the dirt. "Didn't think we'd see you again," he said, his gaze sharp on her. Her stomach twisted. These were the men who had watched her die. The cowboy's voice cut through the tension, low and steady. "You won't see her again. Not if you've got sense enough to ride on." The man laughed, but it rang hollow. He looked at the cowboy, then back at her, as though weighing his chances. Something in the cowboy's stance, in the unflinching steel of his eyes, made the rider falter. After a long, tense moment, he spat again, muttered a curse, and jerked his horse's reins. The group turned, dust rising behind them as they rode away. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the ground, trembling. The cowboy knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "They won't touch you while I'm here." She looked at him then, really looked, and realized he meant it. Every word. The weight of that truth broke something inside her, not with pain this time, but with release. For the first time since she had whispered that they all watched her die, she believed she could live again. The trail stretched on, endless as ever, but now each mile carried something new, a fragile hope, stitched together with the unspoken bond between a broken woman and the cowboy who had chosen to see her not as a corpse, but as a life worth saving. And though she still carried the scars, both on her wrists and in her heart, she began to carry something else too. A spark, a stubborn will, the quiet knowledge that she had not been left to die after all. The night after the riders turned back, sleep did not come easily. She lay beneath the stars, her blanket pulled up to her chin, but her eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. Every shadow seemed to move, every whisper of wind sounded like hooves in the distance. Her body was weary, but her mind would not rest. She thought of the sneer on that man's face, the glint of recognition in his eyes, the way he had said he didn't think he'd see her again. That meant they remembered. That meant she wasn't just a ghost to them. The cowboy sat across from her, his back against a rock, his revolver laid across his knee. He hadn't removed his hat. Meant they remembered. That meant she wasn't just a ghost to them. The cowboy sat across from her, his back against a rock, his revolver laid across his knee. He hadn't removed his hat, and his gaze stayed fixed on the horizon long after the fire had burned low. She wondered if he ever slept, or if he lived always half awake, listening for danger. There was comfort in that, though, in knowing he kept watch when she could not. At some point in the night, exhaustion finally dragged her under. She dreamed of ropes and cruel laughter, but she also dreamed of the cowboy's steady hand, of his voice telling her it was over. When she woke, the sun was creeping across the plains, and he was still there, sitting upright, as though the night had been nothing more than another test of endurance. They broke camp quickly, the unease of the night clinging to them both. She rode in silence, the horse's gait rocking her gently, but her thoughts churned like storm clouds. Finally, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest. Why didn't they try harder to take me back? The cowboy kept his eyes on the horizon. Because they saw something in me they didn't want to test. She studied him, the hard line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. He spoke with such certainty that she almost believed it, but part of her wondered if it was true. Men like the ones who had left her didn't scare easy. Yet they had turned away. Perhaps it was not just his presence they feared, but the fire in his eyes that promised he'd burn them to ash if they tried. The days grew hotter, the sun relentless, the land dry as bone. Their water ran low, and more than once, she feared they would not find another spring. But always, somehow, the cowboy seemed to know where to lead them. He read the land like a book, following the faintest traces, birds circling overhead, the shape of the hills, the way grass grew greener in certain places. His quiet competence reassured her, even when her own strength faltered. One evening, as the sky turned gold, they came upon a small canyon. The walls rose steep on either side, painted red and orange by the fading sun. At the base ran a thin stream, and the cowboy led them down to it. She slid from the horse and waded into the water, letting it cool her burning skin. For the first time in days, she felt almost clean. The cowboy set up camp nearby, his movements practiced and sure. She watched him from the water, the way his hands moved with quiet purpose. He was not a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. Every time he handed her food before taking his own, every time he gave her the warmer blanket, every time he scanned the horizon before closing his eyes, she felt the weight of his choices. That night, as they sat by the fire, she finally asked the question she had been holding back. What happened to you? Who left you to die? His hand stilled on the cup of coffee he was holding. For a long moment, he didn't answer. She thought he might ignore the question entirely, as he had with others. But then he said, his voice low and rough, a long time ago, I trusted the wrong people. Rode with men who only cared about what they could take. When I wouldn't go along with it, they turned on me. Left me bleeding in the dust. Thought I wouldn't make it. She leaned forward, her heart tightening. But you did. He looked at her then, his eyes shadowed by the firelight. I did. And I swore I'd never leave someone else that way. Not if I could help it. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was not empty. She felt the bond between them deepen, forged in the fire of shared pain. They were both survivors, both marked by betrayal, both bound by scars that might never fully heal. But together, they carried those scars differently. In the days that followed, she began to change. Her steps grew stronger, her laughter more frequent. She helped gather wood, set up camp, even learned to handle the horse with a surer hand. The cowboy never treated her as fragile, never coddled her. He simply expected her to endure, and somehow, that expectation gave her strength. But danger was never far. One afternoon, as they crossed a dry plain, dust rose again in the distance. Riders. Her heart clenched, fear clawing up her throat. She reached for the cowboy's arm, and he steadied her with a glance. Keep calm, he said. We'll face it. The riders closed in, 5 of them this time, their horses kicking up clouds. Their leader was the same man who had sneered before, the one who had recognized her. His eyes glinted with malice as he pulled his horse to a stop a few yards away. Well, look at that, he drawled. Thought you'd ride her off to safety, did you? She don't belong to you. The cowboy's hand rested on his revolver, but he didn't draw. She doesn't belong to anyone. The man laughed, a cruel sound. We'll see about that. The tension crackled in the air, thick as a storm about to break. She could feel the weight of every heartbeat, the certainty that blood would spill before the sun set. But when the cowboy finally spoke again, his voice was so calm it sent a shiver down her spine. You watched her die once. You won't get the chance again. The standoff stretched long, the riders shifting uneasily, sensing the danger coiled in the cowboy's stillness. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a sharp curse, the leader jerked his reins and turned his horse. One by one, the others followed, their dust trailing behind them like a retreating storm. Her knees nearly buckled with relief. She turned to the cowboy, words tumbling in her chest, but he simply nodded, as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. To him, it was not heroism. It was simply what had to be done. That night, as they camped under the vast sky, she lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. She thought of how close she had come to death, how many times she had nearly been swallowed by silence. And she thought of him, this man who had chosen, again and again, to stand between her and the darkness. The scars on her wrist still ached, but they no longer felt like chains. They felt like proof. Proof that she had been broken, yes, but not destroyed. Proof that she had lived when others expected her to die. Proof that she was still here. And as the fire burned low, she whispered into the night, more to herself than to him, "They all watched me die, but you didn't." The words hung there, fragile and fierce, and in the quiet that followed, she knew they were the truest she had ever spoken. The fire popped, sending up a thin trail of sparks that vanished into the blanket of stars overhead. He didn't answer her words right away, but she felt the way they landed on him, heavy and unshakable. His jaw tightened, his eyes stayed fixed on the flames, and for a long moment, the only sound between them was the slow, even breath of the horse a few feet away. She thought he might let the silence carry her words away, as so many others had done with her voice. But then he spoke, low and steady, almost like he was talking to himself. Sometimes that's the only difference between the living and the dead, whether someone stays when everyone else walks away. The weight of the sentence settled deep into her chest. She drew her blanket tighter around her shoulders, staring into the fire until her eyes blurred. She wanted to say more, to ask him why he stayed, why he risked the wrath of the men who wanted her gone. But exhaustion pulled at her bones, and she drifted into uneasy sleep before the questions could form. When dawn broke, painting the land in pale gold, he was already up. The campfire was ashes, the horse saddled, the trail calling. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and stood, her body sore but stronger than it had been. He handed her a strip of dried meat without a word, and they began the day's ride. The land was harsher here, rocky ridges cutting across the horizon, gullies and arroyos twisting the trail. They rode in silence most of the morning, the heat pressing down heavy. Her thoughts wandered, circling back to the men who had nearly claimed her life. Would they come again? Would the cowboy always be enough to hold them off? She wasn't sure. But when she glanced at him, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat, the fear didn't feel quite as sharp. By midday, they reached a shallow valley where a trickle of water ran between cottonwoods. They stopped to rest, and she sank gratefully onto the grass, dipping her sore feet into the cool stream. The cowboy crouched nearby, checking the horse's hooves, his hands moving with practiced ease. She watched him, studying the way he worked with such quiet efficiency. He never wasted words, never wasted motion. He was a man carved by the land itself, unyielding, silent, but steady as stone. "You don't ask much of me," she said suddenly, surprising herself. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Should I?" She shook her head, hugging her knees. "No. It's just, most men I've known wanted something. Something I couldn't always give. But you," her voice faltered. "You just, help." He returned his gaze to the horse. "I don't reckon kindness ought to come with a price tag." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any grand promise could have. She lowered her eyes, hiding the sting of tears that threatened. She hadn't known kindness could be so plain, so steady. She had thought it always came dressed in false smiles and hidden chains. But here it was, unadorned, unspoken, yet unshakable. They set out again that afternoon, climbing the ridges until the land opened wide before them. In the distance, smoke curled into the sky, a town. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't been among people in so long, and the thought of walking into a place where strangers' eyes would turn toward her made her chest tighten with dread. The cowboy noticed her stiffen. "We'll only stop for supplies," he said. "Water, food. We won't linger." She nodded, though her nerves did not ease. As they rode into the town, the noise and movement pressed against her like a wave. Wagons rattled, children darted through the dusty streets, women carried baskets, men leaned against posts smoking and watching. She felt their eyes on her, and the old shame rose, hot and suffocating. She wanted to shrink, to vanish into the dust. But the cowboy rode steady beside her, his presence a shield. When they dismounted, he placed a hand lightly at her back, guiding her into the mercantile. The gesture was small, but it grounded her, reminding her she was not alone. Inside, the shopkeeper glanced at her, his brow furrowing at the sight of her scarred wrists, her worn clothes. She dropped her eyes, bracing for the judgment she had come to expect. But the cowboy's voice cut through the silence, firm and steady. "We need flour, beans, salt, and coffee." The shopkeeper obeyed, bustling to gather the supplies. Not once did the cowboy explain her, not once did he make excuses or apologies for her presence. He treated her as if she needed none, as if her worth required no defense. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. When they left the town, supplies packed onto the horse, she released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The cowboy glanced at her. "You did fine," he said simply. She almost laughed, though her throat was tight. "I didn't do anything. You walked through that door," he replied. "Sometimes that's enough." The words stayed with her long after the town disappeared behind them, echoing in her chest like a promise. For the first time in years, she wondered if she might learn to live again, not just survive, but live.